Archon 1964 here. This is a race card from the former Alexandra Park racecourse from May 7th, 1956, and in the near future is nearly one of 4 racecourses contained within the boundaries of London. Why were there nearly 4 racecourses in London? I'd like to do this as a separate video, so to cut a long story very short, original 1960 plans for the new Greater London Authority would add a Kempton Park and Sandown Park to London. Epsom would have been added depending on the boundary between London and Surrey, as the course is to the south end of Epsom. I plan to add a short section from a video of a former course, as was at Alexandra Palace for some 4th round matches in the PDC World Darts Championship in December 2022. However, for various reasons it wasn't practical, and the lads of footage I did take at the end of this video. Alexandra Park was nicknamed the frying pan due to its shape. There's a very extensive article on the Harrogate online website about the course, which I'll give a link to and where I got this picture from. If you don't know the Alexandra Park area, the racecourse is located where the blue symbol is here, and as shown here, was next to Alexandra Palace. Racecourse was called by the Daily Herald newspaper on another day as London's own meeting, and on this day is Ali Pali. I'll give some information from myself as well. Racecourse opened in 1868 and closed in 1970, partly due to the levy board withdrawing support as it did to other racecourses in that period, causing other closures. BBC covered a number of Alexandra Park evening meetings from 1955 onwards, and early on the Church of England were unhappy about this, with their spokesperson complaining about tips being given on the TV and bookies being inundated with bets. Plans looking at reopening it in 1999, but nothing came of it, and part of the course is now taken up by the Alexandra Park Football Club. 1895 spring edition of Rough's Guide to the Turf, the earliest form book I own with this sort of information, states it was pear-shaped and rather more than a mile and a furlong round. Rough's Guide in 1970, the year the course closed, has pretty much the same description, although stating it was 1 mile 2 furlongs round. The 1946 edition of Cope's Racecourse Encyclopedia is a bit more descriptive. That doesn't explain why the course produced such strong conflicting emotions. Chris Pitt has written a book on closed racecourses called A Long Time Gone. The section Alexandra Park starts. They called it Ali Pali. They called it the frying pan. They called it plenty worse than that. He quotes the late TV presenter John McCurrick, who wanted his ashes buried at 1 furlong pole of the course. McCurrick said, "A part of my soul expired with Alexandra Park. Nothing could match the atmosphere of that tiny course near the foot of Muswell Hill. At its demise, the only racecourse within the boundaries of Greater London." McCurrick was a campaigner to reopen the course. However, Chris Pitt also quotes a former champion jockey, Willie Carson, who said, "That place wanted bombing. It still amazes me how horses used to race round there. Ridiculous, really. There's no way I'd be calling it to reopen. It wants to stay closed. It was dangerous. It wasn't good for horses or riders. They're always falling over." Pitt also quotes former jockey Ray Still. "I break out in a cold sweat when I think of it." An opposite view Chris Pitt gives is that of former jockey Jeff Lewis. "It was a great character track." And Pitt quotes former champion jockey Pat Edgery as being a fan early in his career. Alexandra Park nearly saw the end of the career of racing legend Scobie Breesley due to a horrible fall in 1954 at this meeting only 3 days after he'd won 1,000 guineas. It wasn't helped by what was a half-hour delay in an ambulance appearing for what appeared to be a misunderstanding. The papers wrote he appeared not to be badly injured and may rest a day or 2. This is far from the case, and he'd fractured his skull on the railings. Breesley had both eyes paralysed and his sense of balance totally destroyed. He was told he may never walk again and his career was over. He was off for 3 months, but after what Breesley called endless rounds of golf as recuperation, he recovered his career with great success, including winning the Derby. Alexandra Park's final meeting was on September the 8th, 1970, which was to be its last meeting that year anyway. The day before, Richard Onslow wrote about the meeting in the Newcastle Evening Chronicle, saying most of the affair looks decidedly moderate. Day after meeting, both the Aberdeen Press and Journal and the Birmingham Daily Post wrote the course was under threat, as only 2,500 people had attended, with course directors having discussions about this. All the directors, Jocelyn Hambro, said a statement would be made in 48 hours. That Thursday had been an afternoon fixture, and the clerk of the course, Mr. H.C. Clifton, said that a normal evening fixture they get 4,000 to 5,000, and on 2,500 they wouldn't show a profit. 48 hours came the news that it would be expected that the board in charge of Alexandra Park would be closing the course. It was losing £5,000 a year, which would be £55,500 in a day's money. The statement they released said the levy board used to cover these losses, but no longer help. The park had asked the Greater London Council to waive their rent charges for 5 years, but rather unsurprisingly, the GLC weren't keen on this. Reginald Marks, the chairman of the GLC Alexandra Palace board, has said attendance had been very low at Alexandra Park for a few years. He said they offered to reduce the rent from $5,000 to $2,500 for 1 year in the hope the levy board would offer support, but that hadn't happened. The even Telegraph wrote that unlike so many courses which are closed in recent years, Alexandra Park will not become a housing estate, and indeed it never has. A week later, the stewards of the Jockey Club were considering offers to continue racing at the course. However, after a meeting, the Jockey Club said major improvements are needed at the course, and they didn't see a long-term future, and the levy board would not help. Interestingly, the day before, on September 22nd, 1970, newspapers reported that the levy board had bought Kempton Park from its owner for £750,000, who had wanted a major redevelopment, although it looked like he was keeping racing going. And they had bought the course from him for that same £750,000 he had paid for it the previous year. Of course, in recent years, Kempton Park's future has been the source of strong debate. There's drama even for racing began on today's card. A burst water main meant the stewards had to warn jockeys to avoid part of the course. The going was firm, and the Sporting Chronicle wrote, "Slight wind half against runners in straight." In those days, the patrons and officials would appear on the front pages of most race cards. The patrons, Sir William Cook, owned and bred Happy Knight, who won the 1946 2,000 guineas. There's a Times article on October 10th, 1938, he decided to give in on horse racing and sell all his yearlings. He also owned Hornet's Beauty, won the 1911 and 1913 Kingsdown Stakes and the 1913 Portland Handicap. Looking at officials, Lieutenant Giles Harold Loader MC was a racehorse owner and breeder, and with the 1920 Derby with Spion Cop, he was also hand show for Sussex, and my nephew Eustace Loader was the main steward when Craigenore was disqualified after winning the 1913 Suffragette Derby. Giles Loader was 72 years old in 1956, which frankly seemed normal for a steward in those days. He was with the 2nd Battalion of Scots Guards in World War I and wounded at Neuve Chapelle in 1915. Lord Hoffield was called Harry Hastings Sackville Thanet Tufton. He owned Belle of All, who won the 1951 1,000 guineas and the Coronation Stakes. J. E. Ferguson is probably plastics manufacturer John E. Ferguson, who owned Airborne, winner of the 1946 Derby. H. J. Joel is much better known as Jim Joel, and one of the few people to own winners of the Epsom Derby with Royal Palace in 1967 and the Grand National with Maori Venture in 1987. He was 92 years old when the latter horse won. The first of his Jewish secretaries, Brigadier Fowle, also held this role at Aintree for a 1953 Grand National meeting and Royal Ascot the same year. He spent 2 years in the Indian Army in World War II. He was also a High Sheriff of Wiltshire. The other secretary, Major Peter Peel MC, had been appointed as a steward by the London Jockey Club the previous year. He formerly served in the army for 20 years and was a prisoner of war for 5 years in World War II. He used to own racehorses. W.H. Harley was also handicapped at Bangor on D the previous year and was still officially handicapping in 1970. There was a W.H. Harley wrote some horse racing stories from the Daily Herald in June 1939, who may be the same person and again may not be. The starter, Brigadier Mark Sykes, also started a race meeting held from Wolverhampton in January 1961, and I finished that video at some point. There's also starter at courses such as Bangor on D, Bath, Brighton, Folkestone, Hurst Park, Lingfield, Newbury, Newton Abbot and Sandown. There's also a secretary of the Grand Military Race Committee. During the early 1950s, he was for 3 years starter for a 12-day January meeting in Hong Kong. In World War II, on several occasions, he was charged with Winston Churchill's security when Churchill visited North Africa, Italy and India. Currently for sale £439, is a silver presentation cigarette box that was sent to him by National Hunt jockeys in 1962. Some of his military memorabilia has been auctioned. G.W. Gregory was also Clerk of the Scales of Uttoxeter in 1952, and in 1958 he was given temporary licence to act as an acting clerk for a course, which enabled him to do the job at Wolverhampton. He was Clerk for Scales at the last ever meeting at Birmingham Racecourse. Mr. D. Hubbard was clerk for course during the 1954 incident with Scobie Breezley I mentioned earlier. Hubbard is also clerk for course at Brighton and Fauntleroy Park. In June 1961, the Birmingham Daily Post reported that Hubbard had received an anonymous phone call that 2 horses due to one at Brighton had been doped. One of them won, and the other was withdrawn after recording a temperature. Lieutenant Colonel R. H. Knowles also had a veterinarian job at Leicester Racecourse in 1951. Dr. S. L. Matthews, according to Dr. Sidney Ronald Matthews, who was known as Ronald. His obituary in British Medical Journal called him Ronnie, and I suspect he was called that rather than Ronald, were not acting in official capacities. the son of another Dr. Sidney. His dad had been medical officer at Gatwick Racecourse, and Ronnie took over that role as well, as later doing the role at Plumpton as well as Alexandra Park. He had been a captain of the Crawley Fire Brigade and once left a coroner's inquest to help put out a small forest fire. He was also a magistrate like his dad had been. They were descendants of Mark Lemon, the first ever editor of Punch magazine. Ronnie had other sporting interests, being a good boxer and rugby player when younger. Dr. H.A. Byworth is almost certainly Harrow-based Dr. Harold Alfred Byworth, on the simple grounds of who else could it be. His obituary in 1973 said he was a keen astrologer and astronomer and used to present mothers with a horoscope for their babies calculated from the second they were born. Personally, I'd rather a doctor had other things in mind for a newborn baby. Dr. Byworth had also been involved in amateur dramatics, and certainly has to be the same Harold Alfred Byworth, who was fined 30 shillings for speeding in Harrow in 1927. I bet his star-tarts didn't tell him that would happen. To refer to the doctor, his wife's Barbara ran the 7-8 nursery and preparatory school, also known as Auntie Bar's, due to Barbara's name. There's a web page about the school which is very friendly about Barbara and Harold from former pupils who remember it being progressive for its time. Mr. H. Forbes, the auctioneer, had done the job 2 years earlier in the aftermath of a racing scandal. A group of men had bought a not very good French horse called Frank Caskell and a much better French horse called Santa Mauro. They ran Santa Mauro the name of Frank Caskell in 1953 Bath Cellar, with it winning at 10-1. Another confederate cut the telephone wires to stop all off-course money getting to the course to shorten the BSP. A series of small bet stake won the country added up to winnings of in today's money £1.5 million. Hardly surprisingly, the bookie smelled a rat and contacted the post office, who found the damaged cable. The dog club and the police became involved, and after the first trial failed to reach a verdict, the culprit was sent to prison after the second trial in March 1954. 2 horses were sold at auction in July 26, 1954, with Mr. Forbes acting as the auctioneer. Both horses were banned from racing, which seems rather strange when new owners had no connection to the scandal. Forbes pointed out that a lack of exercise over the last year had made them both rather fat. Santa Mauro's new owner planned to use him as a show hack, while Francis Gowell's new owner had no plans for him. Mr. J. A. Morris was Joe Morris, who was a veterinary surgeon at Kempton Park, including when Arkle broke down in the 1966 King George VI chase. There's a picture of him, Tom Draper, the veterinary surgeon, and Duchess of Westminster, Arkle's owner, looking at X-ray of Arkle after the race. Joe Morrison's Kempton Park colleague Alfred Lamont looked after Arkle's injury while the horse remained at Kempton Park until late February, with Morris among those giving updates on himself, so to speak. I'll start by listing the 6 winners on the card and their connections. I don't know the breeders for 3 of them. Looking at the first race, the Tottenham Welter Plate, there are 31 horses listed here. Nowhere near this many horses ran in this race or any race on the card, and this was the same with any race card in the period prior to March 1961. British racing was lagging behind the rest of the world in not having overnight clearances, so nobody's sure which horses would actually win. The Jockey Club, who ran British racing, didn't seem keen to change things, and Racehorse Owners Association were totally against change. Sometimes the winner wasn't even listed in the card, and a last-minute decision could be made to enter them. Newspapers would list probable winners, or that certain horses had arrived at the course maybe the day before. As can be seen here, a racecar at some point has marked off the runners who actually ran, which they did for all 6 races, and managed to mark them off all correctly, which is rather impressive even if it happened after the races. This first race has 12 runners of 31 listed who actually won. The other race was 10 out of 32, 14 out of 47, 8 out of 19, 8 out of 22 and 9 out of 31. So every race bar one had less than a third of listed runners running, and the exception had less than half. The whole situation was embarrassing for British racing. This is actually impressive compared to further Jockey Club stupidity I'll get to later. Molyneux was a non-runner, but in 1953 he won the Prix Gaffidou and the Prix de la Côte de Normandie, which is now called the Prix Guillain de Normandie. That's your actual French, and I have to say I apologise for the pronunciation of those words, which are pretty much butchered. The horse won at least 6 times at Alexandra Park, and not mention trainers in this video unless they trained a winner, as it would take too long on just naming them without explanation. And do the same with well-known owners, unless they had a winner, as many own more than one horse in this race card, and of course even then they might not have won. And talking about owners such as Dorothy Paget and Stanhope Joel, who is the same as talking about J.P. McManus or the Coolmore operation these days, and it would take an age. I make a few exceptions. The first is Captain Ryan Price, who trained and owned Marley Knoll. The captain of the brilliant train of racehorses on the flat and jumps in the 50s, 60s and 70s. He came controversial, as John Randall wrote in Race Report's article, for frankly being too good. I won't mention him more here, as I put out a video on the 1966 Grand National race card I own and will feature heavily there. Two things about Emblem. First, he was bred in Argentina, which is incredibly rare to see one in the British race card even now. In fact, I'm not even sure I actually own a few thousand race cards an Argentinian bred horse. Certainly will be only one or two of them. Secondly, he's not actually pronounced Emblem II or Emblem II. The two Roman numeral part of his name just means he's a second racehorse with that name. I think the breeding is taken into account, and Emblem is the second Argentinian bred horse of that name, but if he's British bred he might be Emblem or listed as Emblem 3. Of course, everywhere still been pronounced Emblem. So for example, that would be an example if there are any other Emblem horses bred here. At some point in recent decades, the BHA banned the use of initials in racehorses. No Home was second in the 1952 Chilham Hurdle behind the brilliant Sir Ken, went on to win that race for the next 2 years as well, as the Arkle chased later in his career, and Sir Ken is the only horse to win both races. No Home existed in two different races in this race card. There's another problem with the lack of overnight declarances. It'd be very rare for a horse to win in both races if they're listed in two races, and there's quite a few horses listed in two races in this race card, but I'll only mention it now on if there's another reason for talking about the horse. I'm saying more so with any horse with a Roman numeral as well. Unless there's a reason for it, I won't mention them again, but it will be quite a few like with that name. I also like interesting breeding names, and Jutland was obviously named after a World War I naval battle and having a sire called Combat. Rowland Ward won this race, and I give a clear form for all 6 winners of our card in this as a part of the spreadsheet. I won't necessarily go for every result they had. It can be boring for me. It can be also boring for people, listening to it as they're going on about, he was placed in this race or that race. But I'll still go for what I can here, what will be interesting. And it was named after a taxidermist who died in 1912, who had been partly connected with hunting, and his sire was Big Game, which again explains the name Rowland Ward. Big Game had won the 1942 2000 Guineas, were owned by King George VI. Rowland Ward was ridden by Bill Rickaby and bred and owned by Lord Roseby, the son of a former Liberal Party Prime Minister, also Lord Roseby, who was also a major racing man and had owned 3 winners of the Derby. The full name of this son, Lord Roseby, who owned Rowland Ward, was Albert Edward Harry Mayer Archibald Primrose. Amazingly, he isn't one of the 6 winning owners on today's card with the longest name. He was known as Harry Primrose, and Ayres Harry Rosebery Stakes is actually named after him. He himself owned 2 Derby winners, was Surrey Cricket captain for 2 years, an MP for 4 years, and Secretary of State for Scotland as appeared for 2 months under Churchill's first administration until Attlee became Prime Minister. When he died in 1974, he was last to die with 397 Liberal MPs elected in the landslide of 1906. Rosebery's son Neil Primrose, 7th Earl of Roseby, is still alive. It's amazing to think the current Earl is the grandson of a 19th century British Prime Minister. Wikipedia website claims that next year Bill Rickaby was sacked by today's trainer Jack Jarvis after Lord Roseby was disappointed by the riding to what they called that Wikipedia called a disastrous glorious Goodwood meeting, although Jarvis and Rickaby left on good terms, and I'll link Bill Rickaby's page on Wikipedia and Jack Jarvis's Wikipedia page in the comments. The Ferret in the Dundee Courier and Advertiser on March 18th, 1954 said Rowland Ward was one of 3 horses that fancied to do well in this season out of Jack Jarvis's 38 2-year-olds. In the end he only had 1 run as a 2-year-old, but it was a remarkable one in October, being 4th in Middle Park Stakes at Newmarket's Rolling Mile course. On the day, the Daily Herald said he'd been well galloped, and Templegate in the same paper said he'd come with a high reputation. The Liverpool Evening Express made similar comments. Nowadays, this race is a Group 1 race, with a lessened influence of 2,000 Guineas since the day when Brigadier Gerard, known factor Rodrigo de Tirana, won it. Race reader for the Sporting Chronicle would want to note after the race. He was described as promising in the Belfast newsletter the next day, and in the Liverpool Echo a few days later. On March 16, 1955, James Park in the Aberdeen Evening Express described Rowland Ward as the best of Jack Jarvis's 33 3-year-olds, and who was seen to be Lord Rosebery's Derby candidate. However, all went wrong, with one unplaced effort and what looks a decent effort in finishing second. It looks decent until he it was a 2-runner race, which he lost by a distance. The White Rose here, listed here, was a maiden at closing race. I've talked about these races before in videos, and they're races a horse could enter as long as they're a maiden when the entries were made. It was possible to enter these if the horse had won in the intervening period. Race form Rowland Ward looked well, and was well supported from 4-1 down to 11-4 favourites, and with race form saying it was down to blower money, i.e. phone money from off-course bookmakers laying off bets. As to Newmarket Stakes, the favourite Acropolis was actually 7-1 on favourite, so no surprise Rowland Ward lost, especially his opponent was one-time favourite for the Derby himself. The issue was the way Rowland Ward lost by running out soon after entering the straight. So in 1955 went from a promising Derby horse at the start of the year into a novice hurdler by the end of the year. Recently High Definition has followed a similar route, but there was a couple of years between him being Antipode's Derby favourite and winning in the Supreme Novices Hurdle. November 19th, 1955, Rowland Ward was declared to make his debut in a hurdle race at Doncaster. He didn't win, but describes a promising run by Major Robert in the Northern Wigan Belfast Post. He was now trained by Bobby Wenton over hurdles. So how much things had changed with carrying 10 stone, with top weight and 12 stone 6, and Rowland Ward was 25-1 and still unplaced. Throughout the race list here, there'll be some strange weight distances as 2 miles and 300 yards. These are white distances as listed in form books and newspapers. After finishing third at the former Manchester course, he was unplaced at the same course on January the 2nd. There was actually their New Year's Day meeting, but New Year's Day was a Sunday and there was no British racing on Sunday until Doncaster in July 1992, so that meeting was held on Monday. He finally won back at the course on Jumbo Wilkinson at 12.5-1. I'll try and avoid using odds like 108 in this video, which is actually the odds he went off at, and also called jockeys by their name they're most known by. So Jumbo was born as Benjamin Edward Wilkinson, but from now on I'll just use a number when names are used, like Jumbo. I've used the excellent Jockeypedia site to work out the full names of jockeys. However, even that site doesn't know the full names of certain apprentices and amateur riders, and in these cases I've just listed their initials. The Birmingham Daily Post wrote Rowland Ward's win was a game display. He then showed his improved hurdling by finishing 4th in Supreme Novices Hurdle at 33-1, although that was known as the Gloucester Hurdle in those days and had 2 divisions. He then back of a flat and suddenly won 5 of the 6 races that year, maybe as a result of Jack Jarvis's decision to have him gelded. Alexandra Park in May he won at 5-1, giving Jack Jarvis his first win of the flat season. He defeated the 2-1 on favourite Epaulette, who was declared in today's race at Alexandra Park, but didn't win on the day. The Sporting Chronicle wrote that Rowland was always going well. Newsboy in the Daily Mirror felt his course of hurdling may have done him good. He then won at the Newmarket Rolling Mile at 100-30 just before today's race at Alexandra Park. Pathfinder of Belfast Newsletter wrote he won easily, and the Sporting Chronicle wrote he won readily. However, race journalist Rolling Mile in the Birmingham Daily Gazette described Rowland Ward as reformed. He then won at today's meeting as Alexandra Park looking at today, 11-10 on the favourite, with the Sporting Chronicle saying it was a comfortable win. For the race, the Belfast Newsletter as I never want to say that of course the hurdling had done him good and had tipped him. Lord Roseby said after his win of this Alexandra Park race that Rowland Ward would have a few more runs of a flat before going back to Bobby Wenton for another hurdling campaign. He then went on to win at Manchester, 11-4 on favourite by 5 lengths. The Sporting Chronicle stating he won easily, and his only unplaced effort was 5th in what is now the Group 1 Queen Anne Stakes Royal Ascot. However, that was a very different race in those days, as open to all ages, not just 3-year-olds, and only one worth £1,200 to a winner, which even with inflation bears no relation at all to today's value of £340,000. Rowland Ward then won at Newbury at 7-4 favourite, and in all of these 6 races you can see he was ridden by Bill Wickerby. He went back over hurdles in the 56-57 season with 1 win and a few placed efforts. Made a short comment about both Nottingham and Aintree, which are the first 2 courses he ran at that season. Nottingham in those days still had jumps racing, and I call Aintree by that name in this video, although those days it was more commonly called Liverpool. He then won back at Aintree in December at 13-8 on favourite under Johnny Gilbert, and his last one in 56 was then placed on New Year's Eve back at Manchester, Handmaid's Deal, one of the 2 horses to win the Champion Hurdle and the Spur Hurdle at the Cheltenham Festival, the latter being a predecessor to a current Stayers Hurdle at the festival. Rowland Ward was then brought down at the old Birmingham course in January 1957. Royce in Canada wrote he fell, but Sporting Chronicle said he was brought down, and that's a view of the papers. The London Daily News wrote that Straight Lad was challenging a final flight by both Pommel and Rowland Ward, and Pommel fell, bringing Rowland Ward down, and later a month the Daily Mirror wrote Rowland Ward had been unlucky to be brought down. He had more bad luck at Aintree in March, when he was second, with the Sporting Chronicle writing he was impeded 3 out. Back with Jack Jarvis over the flat, he went on to finish second in the Great Jubilee Handicap at Kempton, at May 57, a race that sadly now has disappeared from my calendar. He had finished third, but he was promoted by the stewards to second place, and this was on heavy ground. He was then fourth, running again in the Queen Anne Stakes of Royal Ascot, being the closer finish from the far side of the races, and this was on hard ground, and that has been banned at last occurring British racing for the jumps for Taunton in 1996 and Bath for the flat in 1999. He was then second at Newmarket July course, where race form wrote he was sweating. He won 2 races in a row. First at Newmarket as 94 on favourite, gambled down from 6 to 4-1, and then at Glorious Goodwood at 12.5 to 1. Afterwards, Lord Roseby said, before he went to Bobby Wenton to be trained for hurdling, they said he was the biggest dog in the country. Where he battled out the finish today shows what a genuine horse he is now. The Birmingham Daily Post correspondent said Lord Roseby summed up the Jekyll and Hyde character of the horse. In both his wins, he was written by the ill-fated Manny Mercer, and tragically Manny was killed in a fall at Ascot in September 1959. He then won again in the November Handicap Hurdle at Aintree. He'd won the year before. This time he came fourth, and then clear wits of the Brookshaw brothers rivalled him at Aintree, as Anthony was known as Tony, Stanley was known as Tim, and Pete had the first name, Thomas, and of course there's a T in the name of a jockey. The way the form books are written in those days tends to have the official full name as the initial, so I think Peter Brookshaw is the most likely. That month, correspondent Stable Boy wrote in Birmingham Daily Post that Rowland Ward hadn't been successful over hurdles as on the flat. However, he fancied the horse to win the Nuremberg Handicap Hurdle at Kempton that day, and he did win, ridden by Fred Winter, 11 to 10 on favoured, and again gambled down this time from 6 to 4 against. Major Robert in North and Rick had a different view, saying Rowland Ward had done so well over hurdles. On New Year's Day 1958, it was a possible runner at Manchester that day. Talisman in the Northern Daily Mail described him as versatile and on a retrieving mission. In April 1958, a newspaper in Daily Mail wrote Rowland Ward had done his share over flat and hurdles, but was by no means finished. On the flat, Rowland Ward ran again in the Great Jubilee Handicap, where he was second the previous year, and in the Chesterfield Cup Handicap, which he won last year, but this year he was placed in neither. Tony Mottram in the Coventry Evening Telegraph in July 1958 also described him as versatile. After 3 place efforts on the flat in 1958, he came back to form again on the flat in 1959 with 3 wins. Race from Update wrote he looked well before his second of the former Lincoln racecourse on the opening day of the flat season. Rowland Ward then won again at Alexandra Park under Manny Mercer, 13 to 8 favourite, with race from again saying there's phone money from off-course bookmakers for him. He was then third in the same race he'd won on in 1956, the race I'm looking at today, as the 5 to 4 on favourite, before being unplaced 11 to 4 joint favourite in a race Hotspur Star won in 1955, and I'll come to him later. And then Rowland Ward then placed another race that same horse had won in 1954. Again, Rowland Ward bounced back to form, a 20 to 1 win of the old Surrey course at Hurst Park, again ridden by Mercer. He then won at Nottingham at 4 to 1, having gambled down for 6 to 1. It's another race on hard ground, and this time Eddie Larkin was on board. Jarvis thought the horse loves fast ground, that's probably why he felt he wasn't as successful over hurdles. With 2 wins in 1959, both racing from Update and Sporting Chronicle both agree he's now owned by Jack Jarvis. My copy of the Sporting Chronicle ends just before the 3rd win, but Raceform Update stated it was Jack Jarvis. And indeed, Jack Jarvis told the Birmingham Daily Post, the Daily Mirror and Daily Herald in October 1959, that he'd been given the horse by Roseby the previous year. Why this is relevant, I'll explain soon. In 1960, he had 5 flat runs, and Epsom Boy writing in the Coventry Evening Telegraph said the day before Rowland Ward's seasonal debut that he'd wintered well, but his only placed effort was a Newmarket July course. But in July, just to say, but Newmarket July course doesn't just have racing in July, it does have racing over the summer months between June and August, so it can be a bit confusing if you don't understand that. And its final ever flat run was then placed in the Hurst Park race he'd won the previous year, when it was still owned by Jarvis. Daily Herald in October 1960 wrote that Harry Jealous was assistant trainer to Jack Jarvis, to be taken over training of 4 horses, including Rowland Ward over hurdles. Harry Jealous was son of Charles, who was Belgium's champion jockey 13 times. He was also called Charles in a couple of papers, but possible of mixing up with his dad. A Coventry Evening Telegraph wrote on October 28th that Johnny Gilbert was to ride Lord Rosebery's horse over hurdles. They then wrote on November the 11th that 4 of Rosebery's horses, including Rowland Ward, were expected to run at Sandown the following week. That's why I mentioned about Jack Dover's owning Rowland Ward. It's pretty clear Jack Dover's owned him as late as his last flat race in September 1960, but afterwards Lord Rosebery is back owning him. Rowland Ward is back over jumps for the first time in just under 3 years, 1 win and 3 placed efforts. He is unplaced in the Kempton Park Handicap Hurdle on Boxing Day 1960, which eventually was transformed to a current Grade 1 Christmas Hurdle. One of his third places at Nottingham in January on heavy ground was maybe not the greatest plan, seeing as Chuck Jarvis a few years earlier had said he'd loved fast ground on the flat. His win was at Sandown at 12.5 to 1 on Imperial Cup Day under Johnny Gilbert in March, which I'll mention again later. The 1960-61 season has a new trainer in Fulk Warren and a new owner in Lady Derby. 3 papers wrote on October 17th and 18th, 1961 that she was given the horse by Lord Rosebery the previous year, which can't be true for 3 reasons. Firstly, because the Sporting Chronicle stated his own as Rosebery when he won in March 1961. Again, there's no evidence that papers actually owned a horse until autumn 1961, and most clearly Johnny Gilbert contradicts it, as I'll explain soon. Rowland Ward was now novice chasing and won his second race when at Hurst Park and ridden by Fred Winter. He went off 7-4 favourite, having been 5-2 earlier. Both Lord Derby and Winter praised Rowland Ward's jumping in the Leicester Evening Mail. That article also mentioned Fulk Warren's schooling methods over fences. This is a race a Hotspur star won in 1959, even also being of the Division 1 of that race. Rowland Ward was third at Newbury 3 days later as 5-4 favourite, and in April 1962 fell at Plumpton when 94 favourite. He gave his last win back over hurdles at Exeter under Bob McCreary when 2-1 favourite. That jockey later owned a horse called Go Wyam in partnership with Chesney Allen of the Crazy Gang, which won super chases in 5 countries. One was in Spain, as related in Lord Oakes's book Mince Pie for Starters, and 2 others were France and Sweden. Chesney Allen is also known in horse racing circles for inventing the crazy quilt colours carried by racehorses such as Oh So Whiskey, and the name of the colours is called the Crazy Quilt Colours because of Chesney Allen's Crazy Gang connections. Rowland Ward's final 2 career races were in September 1962, was in place at Exeter 6-4 favourite and then second at Ludlow. After retirement, Johnny Gilbert had an interesting article in the People newspaper in 1966 about doping. He said the jump jockeys hated dopers because the risks of an injury possibly fatal went up 20-fold. He said when riding, if a doper was caught, they'd be beaten senseless before the police were called, and some stable lads would have been happy to shoot them. He said a lot of trainers were now blaming doping for horse winning very badly. It was just a bad run, and jockeys can also get this wrong. May well be the case nowadays, in fact, as well. But anyway, he related riding Rowland Ward in the Lilac Open Hurdle at Sandown for Lord Rosebery in 1961, that I talked about earlier. Rosebery had asked what chance the horse had, and Gilbert said the horse looked cold and miserable. Rosebery responded that he'd win, as Rowland Ward had been working well with one of his Lincolnshire entries. Rowland Ward did indeed win, with Rosebery telling Gilbert he didn't know what he was talking about after the race. Rosebery actually told a different story of this to the Coventry Evening Telegraph on the day of the race. He was in Royal Box for a race with Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, a story I'm sure we can all relate to, and came down after a win. He told Johnny Gilbert Rowland Ward was a stone better on this quicker ground. We have to ask therefore, why are you winning him on heavy ground not that long earlier? But anyway, in the article, Rosebery said he laughed after Gilbert had told him, I hope so. That story literally said it was owned by Rosebery, so as I said earlier, it means Lady Derby can't have owned him then. Looking at the other horses here, Jungle Wolf is another interesting breeding name, a South Combat, and this time a Dama Jungle Flower. Epulet, who I mentioned a little earlier as a non-runner, was declared for 2 races, but he also won 1956 Portland Handicap and 1958 Stuart's Cup. Mock Turtle was a name that was super popular in Victorian times, and also later a character in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And Miss Walker has a dam of unknown pedigree. Triple Crown is a horse probably named after Triple Crown St Leger, combined with either 2,000 guineas at Derby or 1,000 guineas and the Oaks. Race 2 was a juvenile selling plate. Neva Hart's another character from Alice in Wonderland. Gap handlers declared in 2 races but one in neither. Amusingly, both Socialist and Red Warning are here declared in the same race, and Red Warning's possibly sarcastic name was a breeding of Sermon and Red Morning. Recent Fable, according to Pedigree.com, won 13 races in the USA. She definitely won in that country and was a broodmare there, but I don't know any more than that. Fair Contract was owned by commentator Peter O'Sullivan. Straightbridge was declared in 2 races but one in neither, and was a Grand Dam of St Leger winner Pelliard. It was a horse owned by Devry Paget and trained by Sir Gordon Richards, who had recently retired. After public excessive section Rowland Ward, the section of a winning filly Royal Spur is hugely shorter. Rowland Ward ran 69 times between 1954 and 1962. Royal Spur only ran 6 times between the end of March 1956 and middle of June that year as a 2-year-old, and that was it. And this is another win for Bill Rickaby, who won the opening race on Rowland Ward. Royal Spur was trained by Vic Smith, who trained 4 champion hurdle winners, including National Spirit twice, and looks like it's owned by his wife. I use his pronunciation Smith rather than Smythe, but either might be right. Of this a selling race, there was no bid for Royal Spur after the race, so auctioneer Mr. D.S. Forbes had a quick time of it. Racecard said the winner was to be sold for a fixed price of 100 sovereigns, which to the best of my knowledge is about £100. She made her debut on March 31st under Manny Mercer, who we talked about before, with Hotspur Star also winning on that day. There was this day when Florrick still had flat racing. After second place Wolverhampton under today's jockey, she was unplaced at Epsom on their Derby Trials Day. Running today's card is a 64 joint favourite by Pathfinder's Belfast newsletter, where Sporting Chronicle she led all the way. A Daily Mirror actually has a typo listing as Royal Sour in their form guide, but correctly as Royal Spirit in their betting. She ran trying some more with one runner at an evening meeting in Alexandra Park. Pathfinder Belfast's newsletter again tipped her, but she was unplaced. Her final race was at Lincoln on June the 13th, and she's the third of 4 runners, and that's all she wrote about Royal Spur. I don't know if she became injured, but she never won again after that June race, when I was saying she was only a 2-year-old. No matter the Lancashire Evening Post tipped her to win the Alexandra Park race 3 days after her last run, but obviously she wasn't a runner. And in fact, no other paper mentioned her possible winning at all, and June 28th, the Birmingham Daily Gazette listed that she was scratched from all her official engagements, so clearly something happened. Neither Index of Rough Guide or Sporting Chronicle listed was dying, which they would do if a horse who ran during the had sadly died, so it's unlikely as a fatal issue, and simply, I don't know. Racefield was a May plate. Howard Carter was owned by Lord Carnarvon. Howard Carter was also an archaeologist who discovered the pharaoh's Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and had been funded by this Lord Carnarvon's father. Howard Carter also had a Sire relic, which partly explains his name. Red Letter won the 1957 Brighton Mile Handicap Challenge Cup, which is still won nowadays, and is one of Brighton Racecourse's very few decent races. He also won the 1957 Crocker Buford Cup Handicap Stakes and 1958 Victoria Cup, both held at Hurst Park. That latter race now held at Ascot after Hurst Park closed, and also the 1958 Roseby Stakes at Kempton. Nutcracker may be named after a ballad by Tusovsky, although technically that is the Nutcracker. Fuss won the 1961 Victoria Handicap at Caulfield in Australia. Rainband won this race with weights raised £4. It's the horse's debut and she led all the way. Race title technically was a maiden closing race, which I've talked about earlier. She was ridden on his 42nd birthday by jockey Scroby Breesley, who also mentioned before with his talking about his fall, which nearly ended his career. And he was champion jockey 4 times and won the Epsom Derby, aged 50 and 52 years old. Rainband was trained by Charles Geraldine in the racecard, although was really trained by his boss Helen Johnson Houghton, who was a twin sister run-on jockey and trainer Folk Warren, who again I mentioned earlier. Women trainer at the time had to use a man's name for the licence. 5 days earlier she became the first woman to train a British Classic winner. Well, deals the race won the 2,000 guineas at Newmarket Rolling Mile course at 50-1. However, in places such as Sporting Chronicle listed Jardine, due to the, as I said earlier in the video, the ludicrous Jockey Club rules. Helen Johnson Houghton's granddaughter Eve is currently a well-known trainer. Went into great depths about this issue with women trainers. The 7-minute video I'll link here, so I won't talk about that again in this video. Rainband was one of twins, and Helen Johnson Houghton told the Birmingham Daily Post the next day that he didn't expect them to be good racehorses. Sadly, the trim was a colt who died immediately after birth. Racehorses giving birth to twins is much more difficult than women doing so. That newspaper article described Helen Johnson Houghton as managing Charles Durden's stable, which pretty much shows what the true situation was. Rainband was bred by her owner, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Innes. He had a few roles, including being estate spurs at Harrow, but lost that job after the governors found he was tipping her boys when he thought the horses he owned had a chance of winning. About a few years later, you come across two young pupils who became friends with each other. These are future TV presenters John McCurrick and Ewan Wilson. His Daily Telegraph obituary also states that Jimmy Ennis was a jockey in his youth, and the horses riding the old Lewis racecourse in Sussex bolted only stopped when it reached the sea. Rainband won at Worcester in June and July, and that track held flat racing those days as well as jumps until 1966, when it became solely a jumps track. While at Windsor in September in the surprisingly named Black & Decker Nursery Handicap, I say surprisingly as like many people I was convinced that the first ever sponsored British sporting event was the 1957 Whitwell Gold Cup at Sandown Park. However, I came across this while researching this video. With this, it wasn't actually the case. In fact, the race we're talking Rainbow One in was actually a successor to the Black & Decker plate won the year before. And assuming this fact is the first ever British sponsored event, the winning horse back in 1955 was owned by all people Sir Winston Churchill. Again, Rainband never won again after that Windsor run, and neither Ruscard or Spanner Chronicle mentioned her dying. It may be as a twin foal. She may have been a little weak and couldn't progress, and so was retired. There's an article on the Horsehound website for 2019 where Dr. Charles Cook, a member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons and working for Equine Reproductive Services, said, "If twins are born live, their combined weight is often the same as the single foal the mother's uterus is designed to carry. They tend to be very weak with an increased risk of neonatal illness." So as I was saying, it's very possible just because she did as much as she could with the strength of her body that she had, and was, as I say, wouldn't have been able to cope with taking 3-year-olds on. You'd be lucky won the 1958 Haydock Park Stay of Stakes and was owned by comedian Al Reed, and that name was a catchphrase of his. Race 4 was the 3-year-old Stayers Handicap, and this 1 mile 5 furlong trip was the longest possible at the course. Trent Bridge was not a ironic name, given another meeting was taking place at Nottingham that afternoon as well, and of course Trent Bridge is a well-known cricket ground in Nottingham. Chilham won this race. Strained by Charlie Pratt, who was tragically killed with his wife in a plane crash in 1962 after saddling win of the Redcar Gold Cup. Jock was Jeff Lewis, who mentioned at the start of this video was liking this racecourse, and he rode winners of all 4 of the classics in Missing Out and Ledger, and his most important rise came in 1971 when the Derby and the Arc of the legendary Mill Reef. Of course, the only horse to win the 2,000 guineas Derby and the Arc is the brilliant Sea the Stars. You have to wonder what Mill would have done if Brigadier Gerard hadn't been winning that 2,000 guineas. Chilham was bred by his owner John Skeffington, who clearly named after his home of Chilham Castle. The Goodham isn't known by his full name of John Clotworthy, Talbot, Foster, Whyte-Melville-Skeffington, 13 Viscount Mazarine, and 6 Viscount Ferrard. I did say Lord Roseby didn't have the longest name of the winning owners today, and he had 6 words, while John Skeffington has 7 words. Chilham's sire Straight Deer won the replacement 1943 Derby held at Newmarket for owner Dorothy Paget. Superstar's career was trained by Willie Pratt, the older brother of Charlie Pratt. Chilham made his debut at Newmarket Road Mile, where Wasteform wrote he was leggy but looked well. In 2020, David Clearing-Townsend wrote, "The most common of the specific shape descriptions is leggy, applied to horse for above average length of leg in relation to its overall height. Its opposite, short leg, is much less common." Chilham back in his debut day was also described as being light-framed and its half-whip round at the start. British Racing didn't have starting sources in 1965. Chilham was resoundingly unsuccessful in his first 5 starts, being placed in all of them, including a run on hard ground at Lingfield. Finally got better results in the last 2 runs as a 2-year-old. First or second place at 22 on a nursery handicap, but unsurprisingly, given his previous form, he was bottom weight, and then 4th at the same course, where Wasteform again wrote he looked well. Chilham was now trained by Charlie Pratt. Given Willie was in his late 70s, may have retired, and Willie Pratt died in 1957. Chilham saw better form in 1956 when an interesting series of jockeys. He was second and maiden at closing race in April under Lester Piggott, before winning at 5-2 on today's card under Jeff Lewis. The Sporting Chronicle wrote he stayed on well. Chilham really didn't want Alexandra Park, as the owner said after a race, for a horse hated fast ground. He was then third twice under Pickett and Lewis, before slightly going in class and winning in the Epsom Derby. The Whyte-Melville-Skeffington family weren't short on money to enter him. Even Charlie Pratt had said that he was more hopeful and optimistic with Chilham's efforts in the Derby. Chilham started 100 to 1, finishing what must have been expected unplaced, and it appears look like it can work out much nearer last than first. He was then unplaced in the King George V Handicap All Ascot, a race that still ran now, and the same on third back at Epsom in a handicap where there was disagreement about the going, but with certain places calling it yielding, again not a common term really used these days outside Ireland for racing, but the Sporting Chronicle calling good going. And so after yielding, especially someone using Irish racing and equivalent to good to soft, it was quite rare to see it, certainly nowadays, used outside Ireland. He was then unplaced at Brighton under very young Josh Gifford, and Chilham carrying 3 pounds overweight, and before too long Josh Gifford switched to winding over jumps because of weight issues, and finally was unplaced at Newmarket Royal Mile. Sporting Chronicle sadly wrote he broke down. But not won in 1957, Chilham reappeared to 7 races in 1958 without being placed. Choosing to bring him back looks increasingly pointless, and would eventually have disastrous results for the horse. Something I noticed about his flat was in 1958, he's now running in the Brown Jack Stakes handicap over 2 miles 6 furlong. That race is named after the legendary former champion hurdler who won the Alexandra Stakes Royal Ascot 6 times. It still exists as a race, and I saw it live in Ascot back in 2021, although it's now a 2 mile race. But 3 of his races successively at 2 miles, 1 mile and 2 miles 6 furlongs, says a lot about ridiculous decisions made about him. Finally, in a decision which defies any logic at all, he was sent hurdling despite having shown no form whatsoever since returning from having broke down. He fell at Shepstone in a race solely of note as the winning favourite was past Searle, who went on to win the 1961 Cheltenham Gold Cup and was one of 2 opponents of Arkle and Millhouse in the legendary 1964 renewal of that race. He sadly, regarding Chilham, the jumped versions of the racing calendar, which he died in 1958. It doesn't mention that he died in the race, but I have to think it was connected. He deserved better. St Crispin is a name best connected with the St Crispin's Day speech given by Henry V just before Battle of Agincourt. Donald with the 1956 Jockey Club Cup. Race 5 of the Park 3 Wheels Handicap. The Saint is probably named after Leslie Charteris character best known for its portrayal by Roger Moore. Nicaltink won this race for weights raised £4. He nearly lost the race before it began as he bolted and galloped riderless before a race for 5 furlongs, which had worried the backers of 3-1 on favourite, and the Sporting Chronicle reported he won easily when he won. His sire Nicaltink won many top-class races in Italy. Nicaltink was trained by Walter Nightingale, who trained Straight Deal, who I already said won the 1943 replacement derby held in Newmarket, and later he trained the winner of the 1965 2,000 guineas. It was ridden by Australian-born Eddie Cracknell, who rode many winners in many countries in his career, and had come to Britain in 1954, and in 1971 became one of the first 5 professional jockeys in Hong Kong, and won his last career wide over there in 1977 on a 35-1 shot. Well, Nicaltink on all his career runs, but twice when Mickey Greening was on board. Nicaltink was owned by Mr. A. Kennedy. Nicaltink won 5 times the 2 orders and impressed on 1 occasion. His debut at Newbury, race form said he had scope for development. I thought in his second race he had physically done well. His third race at the former Lewis course, I must mention a little earlier, in Sussex, and it was his placed effort being Newmarket Rolling Mile. From 1956 was much better with 2 placed efforts and then winning on today's race card I'm looking at now. His run at Newmarket Rolling Mile was on the same day as the 3 handicap and Craven Stakes, those days held on the same day. It was tipped by Belfast Newsletter on the day of his Alexandra Park win. His 4-place of Sandown isn't as good as it appears. There's only 5 runners on what was called holding ground. I'm best missing a different video I'm going to put out as well quite soon. I think that means it's quite heavy rain and then it's dried out, but it's still rather tacky, sticky ground. And his final placed effort was at Lingfield, and he never won again after running at Kempton in September. The North Wigan Belfast Post, that is one newspaper, in January 1957, which was going to Stirling West Indies for 4 years, As a reference, Nicaltink was making a publication of Pagoda in July 1957, where it was expected to run that month to perform a Little Ascot racecourse in the Connolly. That was 5 years before Jamaica became independent. Charleston has an odd note of final September, assuming that's September, not Sept, which isn't anything to do with a month, but a horse, I was saying, assumed called final September, won in 1955, was renamed Charleston that year. Renaming horses used to be a lot easier in the past, indeed I'll soon put out a video about the 1966 Grand National Race Card, when the Angler used to be called Flag of Convenience. Convenience was actually trained by Florence Nagle and not by Bill Stickley, as appears in the race card, and as I said earlier, women were banned from holding a licence despite actually training horses in reality. Pax Romana was named after a period between the start of rule of Augustus and the death of Marcus Aurelius. Race 6 of the Palace Handicap. Desert Way won the 1954 Newbury Spring Cup. Don Basilio is a character from the Barber of Seville. Hotspur Star won this race and tipped by Pathfinder of the Belfast Newsletter on the day of the race, and that was their 4th winning tip of the day for just 6 races. Maybe not a lot at huge odds, but it's certainly a good return for the tipster. Hotspur Star was trained and owned by Vic Smith, who trained Ross Birchwood earlier on this card, as ridden by Stan Clayton. Stan Clayton won the Epsom Oaks in 1951 and 1965 took over the jockey for Queen on replacement of Harry Carr. He held that position for 3.5 years, winning the 1965 Eclipse Stakes for her. After his retirement, he trained in Sweden for 2 years and was assistant to Jack Clayton. In 1975 became assistant to Major Dick Hearn, who was trainer for Queen amongst other people, and Clayton held that position until 1979. In his career, Hotspur Star was owned and trained solely led by Vic Smith. Bookworm, writing in the London Daily News on March 17, 1952, the Hotspur Star was one of 6 promising juveniles sired by Smith's old horse Hotspur. Now, starting with a couple of unplaced efforts, Hotspur Star won the former Folkestone racecourse at Kent in September 1952 as 11-10 favourite, and both sport the Chronicle Sporting Life, stated is owned by Vic Smith's wife, so the actual ownership may be a little confused. He lasted 2 furlongs, and there was no bid after he won the Cellar, ridden by Bill Wickerby. Next race for a card was won by a horse owned by Sir Winston Churchill. Second time mentioned Churchill as owning a horse, and he became interested in owning and breeding racehorses later in his life, and according to his daughter Mary Soames, it gave him great pleasure. Hotspur Star ended 1952 a 4th place at Birmingham, where the Sporting Chronicle wrote he had every chance. He was very busy in 1953 with 10 runs of a flat of 3 over hurdles, the second on the second meeting of flat season ridden by the 17-year-old Lester Piggott. He lost by a neck, and Sporting Chronicle wrote the horse produced a very strong chance of a final furlong. He was in 4th at Epsom, where the Sporting Chronicle wrote he led into a final furlong, when 2nd at Birmingham, again under Piggott, where they said he led into a final furlong and looked the winner. The old master beat even new one, as the winner was ridden by the racing legend 49-year-old Gordon Richards, who was about to be knighted and then won the Epsom Derby the following month. Hotspur Star was then placed at Windsor, and throughout his flat career he was often ridden by apprentices, and on this occasion Art Valentine carried 1 pound overweight. His 3rd place at Epsom on August the 1st was actually in a 3-runner race. Hotspur Star was 2nd at Warwick, where Sporting Chronicle wrote he finished well. The next month he was back at Windsor Closure, this time in Alexandra Park. Sporting Chronicle wrote he was never headed when winning as 11-4 joint favourite under Albert Orme. Later that month he was placed at Ascot carrying £7 extra, presumably for his Alexandra Park win, before finishing 2nd at Hurst Park in October. He fell in his hurdles debut at Fontwell as a 6-4 favourite, was sporting a life record in this ground fairly good. I'm not quite sure that some of them are saying you have some very strange going descriptions. Not quite sure what if that's supposed to mean. He was then 2nd at Sandown before winning a juvenile hurdle by a short head at Windsor, ridden by Dennis Dillon as the 94 joint favourite. And this was in the days when Windsor still had jumps racing. Just the last 2 hurdle races look odd, but that then racing in Britain and Ireland did have hurdle races at below 2 miles. I expect all solely for juveniles and novices. But Windsor race looked like it could be have been his last career jumps won, although he was released of possible clearances for Hurst Park Hurdle March 5th, 1954, but didn't won. But as I will say later on, it wasn't, and some very strange things happened with his declarations. 1954, Hotspur Star is now owned in partnership by Vic Smith and Sussex farmer Bill Brady. Hotspur Star had a better name at 2 of the joint horses, who honestly were called Vic and Bill and Vic. At some point I finished a 1963 Toaster Racecard video, including a winner horse called Bill and John, and yes, that is a horse that Bill Brady owned in partnership with John Sutcliffe. And we're talking about some bad horse names these days. Hotspur Star was again busy on the flat with 13 runs. He was unplaced at Lincoln on the opening day of the flat season. He then won at Sandon in April under, I'm pretty sure, Ivan Pickering, who died recently. Took his own ever called I Pickering from form guides and papers, and I expect Picks is a later nickname from his days as a South African trainer. I found out who I Pickering was due to a single message on an article on the South African website of Sporting Post when Ivan turned 86 in 2021, and that message was someone clearly who knew Ivan and his late wife Desiree well and mentioned him working for Vic Smith in the past. Ivan's obituary after he died in August 2022 talks of coming from Basel to the UK to South Africa as a young man. And I made a comment on one of these, on his obituary, just saying, I wonder if this is the same guy. And someone said, yes, it is. So I'm certain. So basically, it must be Pix Pickering, must be the jockey. So he ended up in South Africa. And he seemed an absolute character. And that article about his obituary talks about him doing Charlie Chaplin impersonations of a walking stick late in life. Also a story that Ivan himself used to relate about his first ride at Clarendon in South Africa as a still young man. He inspired people to say the Zulu word for hold on instead of the word for let go, meaning he was trying to push a horse to the start while the groom was desperately hanging on to the reins. And back to his Sandown win in Sporting Chronicle, which he led early on and also at the end, winning at 8-1. Pickering wrote him to be third at Newmarket Running Mile in May, and probably winning him at Folkestone in June, again from the front. Hotspur Star won at 9-2 with Sporting Chronicle, writing he led over the way. He was back at Alexandra Park the next month to his third in a race won by North Light. He also went on to win the Epsom Derby 50 years later due to a space-time continuing wormhole, or else more than one horse has held that name. After another placed effort at Newmarket, this time at the July course, Hotspur Star and Pickering combined to win Epsom by a head, where again he was never headed according to the Sporting Chronicle. This time he won as 5-2 favourite, ever starting on betting 100-30, and beat a Sir Winston Churchill-owned horse into second place. In August he was unplaced at Newbury at a meeting increasingly called Yielding by Rough Guide. Again, Yielding be used around outside Ireland, not common these days. He had 4 more runs that year, with 3 more to in the top 4 and an unplaced. One of these was ridden by Brian Ford of that point, hadn't had a winner. He won 5 times in 1955 and won the Alexandra Park race 10-1 that he would win this year, and race card we're looking at now. This time again was ridden by Brian Ford, who had actually gained his first win at Lingfield the previous November. Upon that he finished 3rd, 4th and twice unplaced. The final race in Ascot in 3rd place was a Gay Trip, who was again another reused name, this time used for a 1970 Grand National winner. Hotspur Star also won in this race in 1953. There was a very specific reason why he didn't run between June 28th and September 23rd. Obviously he'd been fulfilling a very different role. In August 1955 he was brought to be used for a while successfully by trainer Cecil Boyd Rochford, one of the very few horse racing people to be knighted, along with his stepson Henry Cecil, and Boyd Rochford wanted Hotspur Star to be a galloping companion for his 1,000 guineas Epsom Oaks and Coronation Stakes winner St Meld in preparation for winning the St Ledger, and she duly won that race. In 1956 Hotspur Star's galloping role finished. Vic Smith bought him back for 460 guineas. Vic Smith stated the horse was an ideal horse for leading his tunes in their work, an ideal ride for apprentices, and that line about apprentices is certainly true of Ivan Pickering and Brian Ford. Hotspur Star ran 7 times that year, with sole win on the Alexandra Park race card we're looking at today. The Rock was 3rd in a race which he had been unplaced in the previous year. It was 2nd Epsom in a race he won the previous year, and his form tailed off for 2 unplaced efforts, sandwiching a 4th place, which doesn't look too bad until runners there are only 4 runners. That appeared to be it until bizarrely suddenly reappeared in a Hurst Park novice chase a few days under 3 years into his last race. It was now trained by Nicky Pinch and owned by Mr. S. Norman. He had 12 chases between October 20th, 1959 and June 6, 1960, and were bar a 3rd and a 4th, he was another horse who had a season of completely unsuccessful efforts. And there were some interesting bits and pieces in it. I talked in October, the Birmingham Daily Post wrote that his jockey M. Proctor was concussed after Hotspur Star had fallen, and which he inferred to be a broken leg. A new jockey at Wincanton called Gerald Foster didn't get far as he fell at the first. He was then placed at Wincanton, where the previous race on the card was won by the legendary Cudwell, who won over 50 races. He also won 3 times at the old Buckfast Lee course in Devon, a location perhaps best known now for Buckfast tonic wine drink. Ironically, one of these races was sponsored by a licensed victualler's handicap chase. Oddly, this was run over a distance of 2 miles 300 yards, and he ran another day, 3 days later in the same distance. And I've checked again, these were correct stated distances. There's some very strange distances, I think I mentioned in a few videos. Well, I've no idea why on earth it's not mentioned called 2 miles, 1 filling 80 yards. But anyway, there are the other examples in this period of very odd chase distances being given. From 1960-61 season, he was now trained and owned by Mr. S. Norman and won 8 times, or this time all of the hurdles rather than the fences had been the previous time. And he carried his lack of success from the previous season to this season with 7 unplaced efforts, bar a second-place effort in another form of racecourse, this time Ruhr in Shropshire. A Taunton race there, the Sporting Chronicle wrote he led a long way in that heavy ground. The only thing I've noted is that at Lingford another horse who ran in that race was called Don Cossack. So Hotspur started his career ran against Northlight, Trip and Don Cossack, who will be used as names for an Epsom Derby, an Nature Grand National and a Cheltenham Gold Cup winner. It was written by Gene Kelly, with not only horses having the same names across history as it wasn't for a Hollywood star. So that was it, surely. But no, like a sequel for a film that no one liked in the first place, Hotspur Star was dragged out of the Talbot again for a final run. He was again trained by Nicky Pinch, now owned by P. Wackley and ridden by Mr. F. Hutchinson. He carried £9 over it despite Hutchinson having a £7 allowance. It's a remarkable similar finale to Unsinkable Boxer, as Hotspur Star won a Newton's Talbot selling handicap hurdle in August 12, 1964, with a 14-year-old who wasn't even the oldest runner, a 15-year-old child ran as well. And this the situation with Hotspur Star had not won in nearly 3 years again, and nearly a 3-year debut between races. Race from Roti was 33-1, and it was prominent until halfway. I wonder if the odds should be a hell lot more than 33-1. And surprisingly finished last. Why do I mention Unsinkable Boxer? Well, if you remember him, was a very impressive winner in 1998 at Attempts Hurdle at the Cheltenham Festival. For next season he went novice chasing, with 2 wins salvaging a fall. He optimistically won the Cheltenham Gold Cup, but even A.P. McCoy couldn't get him involved, and the horse broke a blood vessel. He reappeared 2 years later, running a decent race for one horribly heavy ground in the 2001 Grand National, before being pulled up early in the second circuit in a chaotic race. He then ran twice over hurdles in December 2001, and that looked like it. Remarkably, he had one further run at Naas on January the 22nd, 2005, as a 16-year-old, in what was actually a pretty decent hurdle. He was 100-1 always at the back before ending tailed off. And the Unsinkable Boxer was actually owned and trained by the same person who trained him for his debut 12 years earlier. So neither Hotspur Star nor Unsinkable Boxer's final career race made any sense. I checked also the PDF that he mentions Hotspur Star as being a sire, but I don't know any evidence of it. I own various rough guides from a period of 64, 67, 69, 70 and 76, and he's not mentioned as siring any winners at all. Horse Tottenham, I assume this comes from the Hotspur and fulfilment. Well, Spurs haven't fulfilled much in their 62 years of hurt since 1961. I assume it'll be 62 years and counting. Turbine was owned by Rachel Parsons. The Turbine was the first steam-powered steamship built by her father Charles Parsons. The ship is currently in the Discovery Museum in Newcastle. Rachel herself was a talented engineer as well as a major interest in horse racing. And actually, it was a very interesting talk just last month on Rachel Parsons. For 4 of the 6 winning horses, they was their only career win. He's a Royal Spur weighing by Chilham and Nicaltink. Hotspur Star never won another race after today's win at Alexandra Park. Rowland Ward was the only one of any of them, and remarkably he actually won 12 further races.
Some also look around Alexandra Park racecourse, and that's not racecourse, the video I'm meaning to do for that was 2 years. I was going to finish it, and I thought, oh, well, I'll go again and book this a few months in advance, a train ticket. And I thought, I'll just leave it and look around the racecourse, maybe take a video. And then, of course, British thing, the weather. It's going to be pissing down. I thought it was going to still be pissing down walking. It's too early for Metro in Newcastle. I was supposed to be raining now, and actually it's held off, in fact, in the end. There's one raincoat. But Woodgreen as a park, sort of area, it's supposed to be awful weather. I hopefully have enough time after racing, maybe have a look around the old race where racecourse was. It was closed in 70, I think, or maybe 71, I think it's 70. But I'm just checking the time, yes, I've got enough time to still go for a minute or two, don't want to miss the train. So yeah, I may have time afterwards, I think. I don't like when I've gone on too early. I plan to go to the Alexandra Park. It's pissing now, there's no point. So I'm going at the fixed start at 12:50. I think it's a Dowden Derby or Vandenberg Hybrids. But I'll need to just hang around a bit in London and then go up because there's no point heavy rain to do that. Also very windy. It's all complicated. My thoughts the weather's not quite as bad as I thought it was. I think the racecourse is over that direction. The football pitch I think is over there. Hadn't twigged. Is up, of course. you look at the map, it looks like just, you know, it's not 3D. And of course it's really one of the hotels on the palace at the top there. So I don't think it's much more complicated than I thought, and I choose a bit of a way as well, but I think it's over there now. I might try to sort out later on, but it's a lot more complicated than I expected. The sacked in the end, well, there's a shot at trying to go to Alexandra Park racecourse area. It just wasn't practical. I think what I think more difficult than I thought it was going to be. This sort of path which was a sort of race course, a sort of main home straight, just basically in the east. And I was saying was a circle football pitch is in the middle of the loop, but it was really muddy, even just trying to get along the path actually to get down. I was trying to go down over the main road out of Alexandra, from Alexandra Park down towards the train station and going different. And it was just, the conditions are terrible really. I certainly wouldn't have bothered. I had a look and I'm thinking that's not going to work this at all. I might have looked at maybe if I had a chance to answer Palace in the future, but so I'll finish this video, the race card off actually. I had a little bit in from today, but not much.